Cowboy's son was dying of fever. A mute runaway healed him and gained a family. The boy had been burning since Wednesday. I know it was Wednesday because that was the day I'd pulled the south fence line, and I came back to the house with wire cuts across both palms and found Caleb curled on his cot with his knees to his chest, shivering so hard the tin cup on the shelf above him was rattling against the wood. I put my hand to his forehead, and it was like touching the side of a stove. Not warm, hot, wrong hot. He was 9 years old. I'd been raising him alone since he was 4, since Clara passed the winter after the bad flood, the one that took the lower pasture and 2 of our 3 milk cows, and about 6 weeks later, Clara herself, though it wasn't the flood that got her directly. Pneumonia, she was 31 years old. After that, it was just the 2 of us, me and Caleb and the ranch, and whatever God saw fit to send our way, which mostly was work and weather and not much else. I'm not a man who talks to people easily. Never was. I grew up in a house where my father said what needed saying and left the rest alone, and I turned out the same way. I had neighbors, the Groots 8 miles east, the parish widow 3 miles south, and they were decent people. But I didn't go to them with troubles. A man handles what's his. So Wednesday night, I sponged Caleb down with cool water from the well and gave him a little broth I heated on the stove, and I told him he'd be fine by morning. He looked at me with those dark eyes his mother gave him. She had dark eyes, Clara, Spanish blood from her grandmother, and he said, "Okay, Papa." He always believed me. That was the thing about Caleb, he just believed me. By Thursday morning, the fever was higher. I don't have words for what that does to a man. You can face your own pain and it doesn't reach the place inside you that this reaches. Your child burning and you standing there with nothing in your hands. I dealt with sick cattle. I dealt with a broken leg mine 2 years earlier when a green horse threw me against the gate post, set it myself with 2 straight sticks and rode 8 miles to Doc Hester's with it done. I could handle pain that was mine to bear. This was different. This was unbearable in a way that has no name. I rode for Doc Hester Thursday mid-morning. He was 63 years old, Doc Hester, and he had a cough that winter that scared me more than I let on, and when I got to his place, his wife met me at the door and said he was in bed himself with the same cough turned worse. She said she was sorry. I could see in her face that she meant it, and also that there was nothing she could do. She gave me a bottle of laudanum and told me to keep the boy cool and get liquids into him. I knew as much already. I thanked her and rode back. By Thursday evening, Caleb couldn't keep the broth down. I sat in the chair beside his cot, and I'll tell you what I did. I put my hand on his chest so I could feel it rising and falling, and I talked to him. I don't know what I said. Something about the horses, something about the spring calves coming. I talked so he could hear my voice and so I could hear something in that room besides the sound of him struggling to breathe. The lamp was low. Outside, the wind was picking up out of the northwest, the kind that comes before a hard freeze. I was still in that chair, hand on his chest, when I heard something on the porch. Not footsteps, more like a scrape, then a pause, then a scrape again, the kind of sound that could be an animal or wind-thrown debris or something else entirely. I picked up the rifle from against the wall, habit, not thought, and went to the door. I opened it and she was there. She was on her knees on the porch boards, one hand flat on the planking, the other arm wrapped around herself. Young, I couldn't tell you exactly, maybe 20, maybe a little more. The cold and the exhaustion had done something to her face that made it hard to judge. She was wearing a man's coat too big for her, and her boots were wrapped in what looked like burlap, and she had a canvas sack on her back the size of a flour bag, pulled tight with a rope. Her hair was loose and dark, and matted with what I figured, looking closer, was dried blood on the left side of her head. She looked up at me. She didn't speak, and in that first second I thought she was too cold to speak, too far gone. Then she looked at my face, and then past me at the interior of the house, and she made a sign with her hand, not a signal I knew, just a gesture toward the inside, toward the warmth, and I understood that she wasn't too cold to speak. She didn't speak because she couldn't. I stood there for a moment. I am not a man who opens his door to strangers without thinking about it. I thought about it. She was half frozen and bleeding from the head and on her knees on my porch at close to midnight in November. I thought about that. "Come in," I said. I had to help her up. She was heavier than she looked, not fat, just solid the way a person gets from hard outdoor living, and she was shaking with the cold. Not sick shaking like Caleb, but cold shaking. And once she was through the door and I'd shut it behind her, she stood in the middle of the room and looked around. She saw Caleb on the cot. She crossed to him without being told. She crouched beside him and put her hand to his forehead the same way I had, but then she did something I didn't. She pressed her fingertips to the sides of his neck gently, and then lifted one of his eyelids and looked at the eye, and then she looked at his tongue when he stirred and opened his mouth a little. She wasn't doing any of this for my benefit. She wasn't performing a thing. She was checking, the way someone checks who has checked before and knows what they're looking for. Then she turned to me and pointed at her bag. "Go ahead," I said. What came out of that bag, I still think about it. Small wrapped bundles of dried plants, a handful of them, each one rolled in what looked like the cut-up remains of a flour sack and tied with thread. A stone mortar the size of her fist. A pouch that smelled when she opened it, like pine, and something underneath pine I had no name for. A small ceramic jar sealed with wax. She set these out on the floor beside the cot as neat as a man laying out his tools, and then she looked up at me and pointed at the stove and made a gesture. Water hot. I put water on. She worked through the night. I watched most of it. Not because I didn't trust her. I don't know why I trusted her as fast as I did. Maybe there wasn't a reason, but because I couldn't sleep and there was nowhere else to be. She ground dried root in the mortar, or what looked like root, grayish and hard. She added it to a small amount of water from the pot and let it steep, and then strained it through a strip of cloth she pulled from her bag into a tin cup. She got Caleb to take it, a little at a time, with a patience I don't have. He was half-conscious and fighting it the way sick children fight everything. And she just waited, touched his cheek, waited some more, put the cup to his lips again. She rubbed something from the ceramic jar on his chest. Whatever was in it smelled sharp, almost sharp enough to sting your eyes if you got close, but Caleb's breathing eased within the hour. Not fixed, eased. She broke leaves from one of the bundles into the pot of water, so the steam took on a smell I can't describe. Not nice, not bad, somewhere between a forest and a barn, which sounds awful but wasn't, and she covered Caleb's face with a cloth and let the steam rise under it. She showed me with her hand how to hold it, and then she went out. She was gone maybe 20 minutes. I held the cloth and listened to Caleb breathe. When she came back, she was carrying a fistful of something, bark, I thought at first. But it was branches with leaves still attached, thin whippy branches of some kind that I didn't recognize in the dark. She stripped the leaves off at the table, set them to boil in their own pot. I didn't ask. She wasn't answering questions anyway, not the verbal kind. What I noticed, sitting there through those hours, her hands. She had a scar across the right one, running from the base of her thumb to her wrist, old enough to be pale and settled. She had calluses the way ranch women get them at the base of every finger. She worked clean and she worked sure, and there was no wasted motion in any of it. When she decided something, she did it, and she didn't change her mind and redo it, and she didn't look to me for confirmation that she was doing it right. That tells you something about a person. Around 3 in the morning, Caleb's fever broke. Not all the way, he was still warm, but the wrongness went out of it. The heat that had felt like a brand became something more like a bad cold, something you could breathe through. He opened his eyes and looked at me and said, "Papa, I'm thirsty," which was the first complete sentence he'd said in almost 2 days. I had to step outside, just for a minute. I stood on the porch in the cold and I put my hand over my eyes and I did not cry, because I haven't cried since Clara, but I stood there until I could put my face back in the order it needed to be in. Then I went back inside. She was sitting on the floor beside his cot with her back against the wall and her eyes closed. Not asleep, her head was too upright for sleep, just resting. I got Caleb some water and he drank it and went back under. But this time it was sleep, real sleep, not the half-gone burning place he'd been in. I pulled the other chair over, the one from the table, and I sat down across from her. She opened her eyes. "Thank you," I said. She looked at me, just looked. Then she nodded once and closed her eyes again. "I made coffee." When I set a cup beside her on the floor, she picked it up without opening her eyes, like she'd known it was coming, and drank it. I didn't know if that was something I was supposed to read into, some sign of comfort in the house, or if she was just cold. I decided it didn't matter either way. She'd worked all night over my son. She could have the coffee. Come morning, she slept for 3 hours on the floor with a blanket I put over her. And I sat with Caleb and watched the gray light come in through the window, and felt the particular exhaustion of a fear that's been set down, not gone, just set down, and your body not sure yet it's allowed to rest. The boy woke up hungry. That might be the best thing a sick child can do, wake up hungry. I made him eggs and he ate them and then slept again. Real sleep. The fever was still there, but down enough that I could put my hand to his forehead without it scaring me. I went and stood at the window and looked at the yard. The freeze had come last night and the ground was hard and white in the low places. The barn needed feeding. The horses needed water. The world required its regular attention regardless of what happened inside. I heard her moving behind me. When I turned around, she was sitting up, folding the blanket, which she didn't need to do. She set it on the chair and stood and looked at Caleb sleeping and then looked at me, and then she picked up her bag. I said, "You're not going out in this." She paused. I said, "You're welcome to stay until the weather breaks, and longer if you need to." I wasn't sure why I said the second part. I'm not a man who makes open-ended offers, but I meant it. She stood there with her bag and looked at me for what felt like a long time. Then she set the bag down, not put it away, just set it down, like she was thinking about it. I said, "I've got a storage room off the kitchen. Small, but it's warm, has a cot if that suits." She nodded. "I don't know your name," I said. She looked at me and shook her head. Not don't know, I thought. Won't say. Those are different, and I figured I'd learn which one eventually, or I wouldn't. It didn't change the immediate facts. I said, "I'm Elias Cord. The boy is Caleb." She looked at me. Then she made a shape with her right hand, a gesture I'd never seen, and I didn't understand it. "All right," I said. "When you want to tell me, you can find a way." She found a way 2 days later. She took a piece of charcoal from beside the stove and wrote on the back of a flour sack, in letters that were careful and deliberate, "Nola." I said it back to her, "Nola." She nodded. Caleb recovered over the next week and a half. Slow the way children recover. One day they look terrible, and the next they're trying to do too much and you have to make them lie back down. She kept up with the medicine, whatever it was, making him drink the bitter tea twice a day, and I didn't argue with it because it was working. She showed me how to make the chest rub when her jar got low, what ingredients to use, where to find the bark she'd brought. Some of it grew along the creek bottom. Some of it I'd have to get in town, at the Chinese herbalist shop on 2nd Street, which I'd walked past 100 times and never once entered. I entered it the following Tuesday. The old man behind the counter, whose name was on a board behind him but that I couldn't read, looked at me when I came in. I'm not a man who passes unnoticed. I'm 6'2" and broad, and I tend to occupy space, and waited. I pulled out the list she'd made me, the items written in her careful charcoal hand. He looked at it and then looked at me with something like surprise, and then he started pulling things off his shelves. "Where you learn this?" he said. I said, "I didn't, someone else did." He nodded slowly. He told me the names of things as he rapped them, and I stored the sounds in my head even though I knew I'd lose most of them. He charged me fair. When I left, he called after me, and I turned around and he said, "The woman who knows this medicine, she knows good medicine." And he said something else in his own language that I didn't understand, but the way he said it, I figured it was something respectful. I brought that back to her, not what he said in his language because I didn't have it right, but what he said in mine. She was at the table when I got home, with Caleb sitting across from her. He was drawing on a piece of paper a horse, which was always what he drew, and she was watching him. Not hovering. Just there, the same way you sit near a fire because the warmth is good. I set the wrapped packages on the table and said, "The man at the herbalist told me whoever taught you knew good medicine." She looked at the packages and then looked at me, and something happened in her face. Not big. She was not a person who did things big. But something moved through her eyes that I understood to be something she needed to hear, and hadn't expected to hear from that direction. Caleb looked up from his horse. "Who taught you?" he said. She looked at him. She put her hand over her heart. "Herself," Caleb said. She shook her head. She thought for a moment, and then she pressed 2 fingers to the inside of her wrist where you'd feel a pulse, and raised her other hand flat, palm up. An old woman, I thought. That was what I read from it. Someone older. Caleb, 9 years old and completely untroubled by the absence of spoken words between them, said, "Your grandmother." She went still for a second, then she nodded. I started to learn the ways she talked. Not a language, not the kind with rules and a dictionary. Just her ways, a tilt of the head, the direction her eyes went, the way she'd pause and look at something distant when she was working out how to make a thing understood. She was precise, even without words. She didn't gesture loosely. She found the clearest motion for the idea and used it, and if I didn't understand, she tried a different way and didn't show impatience when it took time. She started helping around the place. Not because I asked, I didn't ask, she started. In a week she knew every animal's name and temperament. The bay gelding cord, I'd named him after myself, which Caleb found endlessly funny, would lay his ears back at strangers, and she walked up to him on day 3 and put her hand on his neck in a particular spot, and he let out a long, slow breath and stood quiet. That's not something you can do by accident. She knew where that spot was. She helped with the cooking. She couldn't read my recipes, such as they were. Most of what I cooked came from memory or from trial and a great deal of error. But she could watch once and repeat it, and she added things that improved it, spices she had in her bag or could find in the pantry, and I noticed it but didn't say anything about it the way you don't say anything about good weather. You just don't want to jinx it. Caleb was halfway through a second drawing of the same horse the day he said to me, when she'd gone out to the barn, "Can she stay, Papa?" I said, "That's up to her." He thought about that. "She's not going anywhere," he said. "I can tell." 9 years old, but he wasn't wrong. I'd begun to think the same thing, or to let myself begin to think it, which is a different and more careful operation. She did not offer me a history, and I did not ask for one. I am not, as I said, a man who needs words where the facts are plain. The dried blood in her hair, the too large coat, the burlap on her boots. She'd left something fast. Someone or something had got her moving in the wrong direction on a cold night. Whatever it was, it had put her on my porch, and she had put herself to work the moment she came through the door, and for now that was the whole of the story that mattered. But there were things I needed to know for practical reasons. I put them to her one afternoon in the barn while we were working side by side at the stall gates. She'd spotted the hinge on the second stall was pulling loose, and had the tools in her hand before I'd noticed. I said, "Is there someone who might come looking for you?" She set down the wrench and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she nodded. "A man," I said. She turned and looked at me. She tilted her head once, yes. I said, "Is he dangerous?" She looked at me for a long time, then she nodded. I said, "Then if he comes here, I'll handle it. You don't have to worry about that." She looked at me. I mean, she really looked at me, not the quick glance of someone hearing words and moving on. She held it. I said, "I mean it." She picked up the wrench and went back to the hinge. But after a moment, she paused and reached over and put her hand on my forearm for just a second, the briefest contact, like something she'd decided, and was saying with her hand the way she said everything, and then took it away and kept working. I went on working too. He came 5 weeks later. A man named Dre, I found out later, someone the Groots knew by reputation, which was not a good one. He came on a Thursday afternoon when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the air had the smell of a storm coming, that electric cold smell. I was at the far end of the near pasture when I saw him ride in through the gate. I walked back to the house, not hurrying, not because I wasn't concerned, but because you don't let a man like that see you hurry. By the time I got to the yard, he was off his horse and standing at the porch steps, and she was in the doorway. Caleb was at school. I'd been driving him the 3 miles to the schoolhouse each morning since he recovered, something I hadn't done before she came, that she'd suggested in her way, and that I'd agreed was right. Dre was thickly built and had a beard that needed attention and eyes that moved too much. Men with eyes like that are doing math all the time. I didn't like his math. He was saying something to her when I came up. She was not backing up. She was standing straight in the doorway and looking at him without expression, which I knew by then was how she looked when she was being very careful about something. "Help you," I said. He turned. He looked me up and down the way men like that do, assessing, deciding. He'd done it before in his life. It was quick and practiced. "Just looking for something belongs to me," he said. I said, "Don't see anything like that here." He smiled, which didn't reach any other part of his face. "Now that woman there," he said. I said, "That's my wife." The word came out before I'd fully decided to say it, but having said it, I stood by it. He looked from me to her. She stood in the doorway without altering her expression by a degree. I will tell you that about her. Whatever went through her in that moment, it did not change her face. "Is that so?" Dre said. "It is," I said. He looked at her again for a long time. She met it. Did not look away, did not shift, did not give him the inch he was measuring for. Whatever he'd thought to find when he rode in here, a frightened woman, a soft arrangement, something he could leverage, he was not finding it. His eyes went back to me. He was still doing math, but the numbers had changed. I was holding the rifle. I hadn't raised it. I don't raise a thing unless I'm using it, and there was a chance I wouldn't need to use it, and I try to give a man his chance to make the right choice. My father's principle. He was a hard man, but he believed in giving the other man his chance. After a moment, Dre said, "Man changes his mind about what's his." I said, "Good enough." He mounted his horse. He looked at her one more time, not at me, at her, and I don't know what he was looking for, some crack, some signal. He didn't find it. He rode out. I waited until he was through the gate, and the sound of the horse was small in the distance, and then I let out the breath I'd been carrying. I turned around. She was standing at the edge of the porch, not in the doorway anymore. She had her arms at her sides. She was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her yet, or not fully, something that wasn't careful, something open. Something that had the particular quality of what comes through when a person has been holding something hard for a long time, and someone has just finally taken a portion of the weight. I said, "He's not coming back. Not if he's got sense." She came down the 2 porch steps and walked over to me and stood close, closer than we'd stood before, which was never close. And she looked up at me, and then she did something I wasn't expecting. She put both hands against my chest, flat, not pushing, just resting them there, and looked up at my face. Her eyes were gray. I hadn't been close enough before to know that. Gray with something lighter in them, like creek water has color that changes. I put my hand over both of hers, left it there. Neither of us said anything, which was fine by us. After a while she stepped back and we went inside. I need to account for what happened next, and I'll do it plainly. Nola and I married in February. Magistrate Hollies rode out from town, which he did twice a year for folks who couldn't make the trip, and we stood in the front room with Caleb as witness. The ceremony was short. When it was done, Hollies shook my hand and nodded at Nola with what looked to me like respect, though I don't know how much he'd figured out about her circumstances. Magistrates who ride out to ranches twice a year see enough that they don't ask for more than what's offered. Caleb made a speech. He was 9 3/4 by then. He said that he was glad she'd come because now he had someone who understood about the horses, and that was the best part. Then he thought about it and said the food being better was also a good part. I told him that was probably enough speech. He agreed and sat back down. She was laughing. Not with sound, she never had sound to it, but with her face, her whole face, the way some people laugh when they've given up worrying about whether they look foolish. I hadn't seen that yet. I stored it away. Spring came the way it always does in that country, all at once and then too much, with mud roads and flooded low spots and calves coming faster than you can keep track. We worked through it together, and I say together because that's what it was by then, not me handling it and her helping. She'd learned the ranch, and the ranch had done what ranches do for people who treat them right, which is to let them in. She found things I'd been doing wrong for years. South fence needed different anchor posts. She showed me by showing me the lean, which I'd explained to myself 100 different ways that all amounted to I'd get to it, and we replaced them in March. The kitchen garden, which Clara had started, and I'd kept going in a rudimentary way that grew less interesting things than it should have. She replanted it in April with a plan that I couldn't follow, but she could, and by June we had more than we needed, which is a different situation than we'd been in before. She wrote when she needed to say more than gestures allowed. Her handwriting was slow and careful, each letter formed like she was aware of the responsibility of it. She'd learned to write the way you learn something no one's sure you'll ever need. On the back of whatever was at hand, flour sacks, the margin of the almanac, sometimes a smooth piece of board with charcoal. I learned more of her ways, and she learned more of mine. She knew before I said anything when something was wrong with the animals, the same way she'd known what was wrong with Caleb. She had that attention. When I came in from the barn tight around the jaw because the breeding hadn't caught and we'd have fewer calves than we needed to pay the bank note, she didn't ask me about it directly. She put coffee in front of me and sat across from me with her own, and looked at me and waited, and somehow in that waiting, I said more than I would have said to anyone who'd asked. In July, the Groots came by. Lars Groot and his wife Margit, who I'd known for 12 years and spoken to maybe 40 times in aggregate, which is the math of isolated ranch living. They'd heard I'd married, the parish widow had seen us in town, and Margit had brought a pie, which was the proper thing to do, and she was the proper kind of woman. They stayed for supper. Nola cooked. She'd planned it. I could tell by the way she'd gone at the store of dried things in the pantry that morning, and what she put on the table was more than I'd ever managed for company or close to it. Margit watched her work and then said to me, in the quiet way of a woman who has decided to mean what she says, "You've done well, Elias." I didn't say anything to that, but I heard it. Nola caught my eye across the table. I don't know if she'd heard. Maybe she had. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me that November night after Dre rode out open direct, the careful look gone. Lars Groot, who was not a man for sentiment, said after supper that he'd heard the south fence work and wanted to know who'd figured the anchor post problem because he had the same lean in his east line. I said we'd figured it together. He looked at Nola and nodded. They rode home before dark. When I went out to see them off, Lars shook my hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake usually runs. He didn't say what he meant by it, but I knew. He was the kind of man who notices when another man is doing all right after a time of not doing all right, and who marks it with something quiet. Caleb started calling her Mama in August. He didn't ask permission. He didn't announce it. He just said it one morning when he was looking for his hat. "Mama, have you seen my hat?" And she found it on the hook by the door where it lived when it was in the right place and he wasn't wearing it, and she handed it to him, and that was the sum total of the event as it happened. He looked at me after, checking. I wasn't sure what he was checking for. I nodded. He grinned and went out the door. She was standing by the hook where the hat lived. I looked at her. She had both hands pressed flat against her collarbone. Something in her face that I can only say was the look of someone receiving something they had almost stopped believing was possible, not performed, real. Contained the way she contained everything, but real underneath. I said, "He's right." She looked at me. I said, "If you want it, he's right." She looked at me for a long time. Then she crossed the room and put her arms around me, both arms, and pressed her face against my chest. She was not a small woman, and she fit the way someone fits when they've found the right place. I put my hand on the back of her head. We stood like that in the kitchen, with the morning coming through the window, while Caleb's footsteps crossed the yard outside, and the horses in the barn made their regular morning sounds. I am going to tell you what that moment was. That moment was the weight leaving. Not all of it. Weight doesn't all leave at once, and anyone who tells you different has not carried much of it. But the part of the weight that was being alone with something too heavy, that part left. I had been running this ranch and raising this boy and being the only person responsible for both for 5 years since Clara died, and I'd done it because it was mine to do, and I am the kind of man who does what's his. But I will tell you honestly, there is a difference between doing it alone and doing it with someone beside you. Not someone who does your work, someone who is there, someone who stays. She stayed. She chose this. She chose the cold porch in November, which I don't think was choosing exactly. She was on her knees and close to done. But she chose everything that came after. She chose to set down her bag. She chose to write her name. She chose to stand straight in the doorway when Dre came and not give him the inch. She chose the kitchen and the garden and the south fence and the horses and Caleb with his hat on the wrong hook. She chose me. A good woman choosing a man is not a small thing. It doesn't matter how many people in the valley know your name or how many acres you run or whether the banknote is paid. When a good woman looks at you and stays, that is the measure. I didn't know that before she came. I knew it after. Caleb, this past summer, asked me one night when I'd come in late from a calving. He was 10 by then, long and serious the way boys get when they're thinking about becoming something. He said, "Papa, how did you know she was the right one?" I thought about that. I said I didn't know, I just made room. He thought about that too. Then he said, "Is that how it works?" I said, "Sometimes that's all it is." He went to bed. I heard him through the wall, the sound of him settling, the particular silence of a sleeping child in a warm house. Nola was at the table with the lamp, going over the seed order I'd been putting off. She'd taken that over, the accounts and orders, the charcoal and flour sack writing replaced by proper ledger pages in her careful hand. She heard me come in. She didn't look up right away. She finished the line she was on and then looked up. I hung my hat on the hook, on the right hook. She watched me. Then she tilted her head a little, the question tilt, asking how the calving had gone. I held up 2 fingers. She smiled, Not the whole-face laugh of that first winter, a quieter thing. The smile of someone who knows the ranch and knows what 2 calves on a cold night means. I sat down across from her. She went back to the ledger. I watched her for a while, the lamp low, the house settled around us, the boy asleep down the hall, the stock in the barn, the winter coming but not yet arrived. All of it ours. I said, Nola. She looked up. I said, thank you. She didn't make a gesture, she just looked at me. And in the way she looked, I could read everything she was saying, all of it, clear as any words I'd ever heard. Then she looked back down at the ledger. I sat there in the quiet and listened to the scratch of her pen.